Hello out there, and welcome to the No Shitcast. I'm your host, Matt Fraser. Really cool guest today, as usual, sitting in the hot seat with me tonight. My co-pilot for the festivities, Shifu Ramon Careaga. How you doing tonight, Shifu?
I am doing fantastic, and how are you guys doing?
Not too bad. Shifu brought me a guest tonight. Mr. Gareth Samuel is going to be joining us on the line. We're going to be talking about electric universe stuff tonight. Gareth is a physicist and a former educator, and he's got a channel called the See the Pattern channel on YouTube you should check out. So, Gareth, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you.
So I'm really glad you guys both took the opportunity here to come and talk with us. And Shifu's been shooting me some messages here, lighting up my Facebook Messenger, if you will. There's a lot of stuff that's been going on here recently with some new science that's come out and some new studies and discoveries and stuff. Shifu, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been, as predicted, a continual progress in proving plasma electromagnetic cosmology correct. And essentially what's happened is they've launched a slew of satellites half a decade ago and they're continuously launching more. And the longer they're up there collecting data, the more they keep finding examples. They'll find radio wave and X-ray data. And then they're starting to actually get a good pattern or track on these magnetic filaments that are out in space. And if there's magnetism, there's electricity. So by almost kind of reverse engineering, not doing it on purpose, obviously, mostly they were up there looking for dark matter. And they're not finding that, so they've been just versions of dark matter. I'm sure Gareth will want to mention some of those. Some of them are like millions to trillions of times bigger than protons. Completely insane.
It's funny since you guys, like you and Neal and everybody's kind of turned me onto this subject, man. I'm seeing this stuff all the time now. It's kind of bizarre, but it's like once you learn how to read the signs, they're everywhere. And we've actually just done a couple shows. We did one on the saving Schrodinger's cat, and I know that's got ramifications. I think we did talk about the superposition stuff that just came out with it taking time. And then I saw I think it's the filament stuff that you're talking about, where they can see the magnetic connection between two, what was it, solar systems or something. I think I actually pulled that one off because I wanted to make sure I got the chance to get you guys to chime in on it. So there's been a lot of really big stuff happening here very rapidly, right? Like within the last month or two, things have really been dropping on this subject.
I think there's a greater appreciation. I think that the science community is finding this evidence. The problem is they don't always recognize it for what it is. So if you take the example of the two galaxies that they recently discovered, there was effectively a bridge connecting the two galaxies together. And so when you look at the images, you can see there are images which are visible light, where you wouldn't see anything. You see nothing between the two galaxies. And then they overlay on top of that an image which shows the radio, and you can very clearly see that there is an echo coming from in between these two galaxies. And then there's another image they do where they have the X-ray, which shows that there is X-ray activity at one of the ends of the galaxy. And you kind of look at that and you go, whoa, what does that actually mean? Well, it implies, yeah.
So if someone's coming into this cold, what we're talking about here is paying respect to the electromagnetic connections that all physical bodies in the cosmos would have with each other, and right? That's kind of the 100,000 foot view, if you will.
I guess the more that we look into space and the more that they've tried to search for dark matter, the more, in fact, what they see is plasma and dust. Where they expected to see dark matter and never found it, they see plasma. And what this recent discovery shows is not only is in like this plasma between these two galaxies, but it is moving, and it is not moving at a slow speed. We are talking, speeds that are approaching the speed of light. These are very fast moving. I mean, they are vast distances, don't get me wrong, but it does show that this interconnectedness is not just a fingerprint left over from some time way in the past, but it is an active network connecting all of the galaxies together.
Now we're not talking about the cosmic background radiation here, right? This is a new phenomena that they're monitoring, that they're paying respect to now, right?
Yes, and it's something they've known about for a while. So I guess as they started to look, they started to see this structure. So we know that from, obviously, if you go from the small scale, we orbit around the sun. Then our sun is a group of stars that are locally sort of attracted to each other. And then we orbit around the center of the galaxy. And then we know that galaxies themselves cluster together. So there are groups of galaxies that tend to be moving in the same direction. And then on an even larger scale, groups of galaxies group together. So it's almost like a sort of fractal structure within the universe where there is this hierarchy that you start to see. And what they see is this, where this plasma is being deposited, where they detect it, is exactly where you see all these clustering. So where particular veins of these filaments meet is where you tend to find the larger clusters of galaxies, implying that clearly something must be going on where these, and we now know that they are flowing currents, meet. They must be causing some of this matter to be created. Now, obviously, from a classical point of view, they would tell you that that's all gravity driven. And in fact, they would tell you that the reason that the filament structure exists is nothing to do with electricity. It is to do with dark matter. So the dark matter in their idea clumped on the outside and caused matter to clump together. So it kind of forced all of the matter together. The problem is that wherever they look for this dark matter, they don't find it. Right. Yet they still hold on to this idea that that's what caused it.
And what happened midway through last year, and I detailed this in the paper, I had made a prediction that they were going to start switching to this electrical dark matter. And they, in fact, released a paper about so-called charged dark matter. So they needed to borrow a mechanism to help along the process, and they just really started going into the electrical cosmology, and they did it almost kind of silently. And in fact, so I detailed it in a paper. That paper has achieved a higher paper page rank as people are starting to cite that paper.
That's nuts, man. I mean, that article, when it came, I looked at that and I was like, holy crap, here it is. Like in physical, like you can see it now. It's measurable. It's there. And yes. I was like, oh, wow, this is going to be a big deal.
And the dust and the half of the dark matter being found as baryons was not a small deal. And that was also last year, I think. All this local dust or cosmic dust or covert dust, it is all also for the most part, as I understand it, is mostly behaving sort of like a solar wind. It's charged kind of space, and it's taking up huge amounts of the mass in the universe, much more than we could have known in the Hubble era, and the interactions of it is perhaps having a huge influence on even larger bodies than you would think, because if you think about it, we've measured the dust in the solar wind here in our own solar system,
right.
And each grain is representing about 4 to 5 volts.
Yep.
Now that might change. The potential might drop significantly by the time you get out towards Pluto or into the Oort cloud, etc. But it's still a non-zero effect. There's something happening there, and you can still to this day find tons of phys.org forum bashings where they say charge separation in space is impossible, blah blah blah. That's all going out the window really fast.
Let me ask you guys. Go ahead, yeah. Gareth.
I was going to say that the thing on charge separation, it always makes me laugh when I see that, because it was Hannes Alven who kind of came up with this idea, and he very much saw because he analyzed not just the aurora, but obviously the what's happening in the corona in the sun, and he saw this effect where charge was being separated, and his view was very much that the universe was filled with charges that were able to separate themselves, and he likened it very much to like a cellular structure where you would have cells within cells within cells, and as you go up, obviously cells organize themselves into tissue into, I mean, I don't want to teach biology, but the effect that these things are connected. I mean, if you look at the solar wind, we know that the solar wind drives the aurora on Earth, but it's not a direct connection. It's not like the solar wind streams down into the upper atmosphere. They are separated, and this is exactly what he was talking about, these charge separations. And that's very much the way that you have to think about some of these circuits. As they are like loops that kind of connect to each other. It's a bit like, I mean, you probably don't have it in the States, but in the UK, a lot of our heating in our houses is done through hot water. So the hot water system is a closed system. The water pumps around your radiators, and that heats your house. The hot water doesn't leave your radiators. And that's the same sort of mechanism that you need to think of in terms of these circuits.
Well, it follows that rule, though, that energy is never lost nor gained. It just changes state, right? So that there's by that consideration, then there is a finite amount, I guess, of energy, correct? And then it's all just being exchanged and changed into different states back and forth over and over and over again, like a giant ecosystem or something like that. Yeah,
I want to point out something because one of the big detractions, people will go, well, where's all the energy coming from? Let's say two things. Number one, plasma electromagnetic cosmology does not violate any laws of thermodynamics. We are all for 100% following the laws of thermodynamics. The energy for the sun would be coming from a larger structure. And in fact, those larger structures are moving even faster than the sun is. And the sun is moving faster than the earth is because, again, the current is stronger. Number two, the standard model, people must understand that the gaseous sun got its start after spectroscopy got its start in the 1840s. This is before there was electromagnetism, number one, and in terms of codified, right? There had been electric studies going back to the 1600s and magnetic Torella experiments going back to the 1500s. But there hadn't been Maxwell's equations yet. And so the gaseous sun was invented as a way to explain the spectroscopy they were seeing in helium. And then they needed a mechanism. They had to go with gravity because there was no atomic model at the time. There was no electron until the turn of the century. And even some of that, not even until 1910, officially recognizes, hey, this is, if you want to call it, established science. So they didn't have a good mechanism for that. Now the standard model sun is supposed to be it's a ball of gas collapsing, working on itself. And doing work on yourself is a violation of thermodynamics. It does not make sense. We've never had fusion that will sustain in that manner. And all fusion experiments to this day that are serious fusion experiments are plasma experiments. So that the big Chinese reactor, the one out there in California, I forget the name of the lab. Those Sandia labs. Those are plasma machines. And we are putting in massive amounts of energy into those experiments. So the idea that the standard model has got it right, and then we're just drawing energy from nowhere is not correct. It's not to say that there aren't people in the electric universe who are big supporters of ether, but we aren't just creating energy from nothing. It's coming from a larger source, always from a larger source. So the galaxy is getting its electricity from the supercluster above it, and then there's an interaction, and it's a famous image. It's supposed to be showing the interaction of gravity between all the dark matter within one supercluster and the other, but I think that it looks exactly like cellular mitosis. There's an interaction between these two superclusters, and I would imagine there's probably a connection between these two superclusters as they're interacting and other superclusters around them, and it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Hey, do me a favor, guys, okay? Because I'm an idiot, all right? And what I want you to do is, so what we're kind of talking about here is what it looks like, and this is a layman's observation, is that in physics, through our standardizations of how we look at physics, we've given gravity too big of a responsibility for things, and it appears that there's actually two pieces of that puzzle that we're calling one right now. Like we're calling this electromagnetism and gravity, we're saying gravity's doing all of that, and kind of what you guys are getting at is that there's mounting evidence that there's two separate pieces at work there, right? Or am I completely full of shit here?
No, I think the classic theory is that everything is driven by gravity, and I think part of the problem comes from, when you go back to the turn of the century, they wanted everything to be clean, very kind of mechanical. It had to be, systems, and therefore gravity was, a nice system that they understood. The reality is, when we look, if you just look within our solar system, if you look at the effect that a proton has as it orbits around the sun, even if you stick that out at the orbit of Pluto, the effect of the magnetic field that the sun has on a proton at the orbit of Pluto is 600 times stronger than the effect of gravity.
Wow.
So it's ridiculous to look at it and assume that the only force that's going to act on it and the only force that's going to shape it is going to be gravity. Clearly, the other force, the electromagnetic force, must play a role. Now, I personally believe that it is not the only one. I think there is a mingling between the two. So the gravitational model still holds. It's still a force that we see, and it affects objects. But we have to take account of the electrical effects of these objects as they rotate around it. And Hannes Alfvén had a very nice view. He said that if you take just gravity and you take a galaxy, and you assume that galaxy formed in some way. Okay, we don't know how galaxies form, but let's just assume that it formed through a gravitational process. So stars are being attracted and they start to rotate around it. If you think about it, as the stars move around this, there is a magnetic field that will start to spiral around the center of that galaxy. And that movement of that magnetic field is just like a motor. And that motor will drive an electric current. Even if you stop the rotation, so if you said that gravity doesn't play, the rotation would continue, and that would still power that galaxy for hundreds of thousands of years. So in his calculations, when he looked at it, he said that there was enough kinetic energy stored in the galaxies to drive the currents that we see flowing through the galaxies. I think the reality is probably a lot more complex than that, because we know there are a lot more forces at play. But even if you simplify it to that point, you can see that we're not making energy out of nothing. That energy is already existing in other forms, as you say. We're just transferring it from one type to another.
Okay, so I think I asked Neal this question. This might be a little silly, okay? I want you guys to, and I'm not sure if I don't think I asked you this, but to what end? Once we understand all of this, right, do I get a hover car? Like, how does it have like significant, what's the significant ramifications of this?
I'll tell you exactly the ramification. First of all, you can't leave out the possibility that we are a scarred species, and that's to get into Velikovsky, and I don't want to do too much of that, but I do want to say that behavior is undoubtedly obsessive in the direction of the cataclysms, and so we keep searching for more and more of this power, and we achieved one of the weapons of the gods through the nuclear interactions, right? But at the world very from a view of lack and of adversarial kind of position. But the truth is that we have more than enough energy. We can actually be very inefficient.
Right.
There's just energy all over the place,
Yeah.
and that we could waste most of it. The way that we're doing it is actually the hard way, because we are doing what Tesla said was barbaric. We are burning a fuel to create electricity. That's not how nature does it. Nature is providing it all the time in these constant currents. So we have to inject technologies for harvesting these currents in the places where those currents are, namely in the belts of radiation that go around the Earth. And probably in the interaction, okay, there are these flashes that are happening on the moon, which means that these interactions are still current on the moon. They can last for hours. These flashes they scar the moon. So we can establish bases on the moon. We can harvest. We can put satellites out in space, create a network. We can use lasers to exchange energy. We can do a whole lot if we just want to.
Tesla intuitively knew this. He didn't, he wasn't someone who was taken to, writing documents, or he just had an intuition about how electricity worked. And I very much believe that he did uncover some of the things that we are now discovering about how the electric current system works in our planet. And he said that he was able to extract energy out of the Earth, and one of his goals was to provide free energy for everybody, which is obviously one of the reasons why he was kind of stopped doing what he was doing. But that idea, effectively, you look at the way he designed it, it was a combination between sending radio waves into the atmosphere and then also at the same time sending a current through the Earth. And if you look at our understanding of the way current systems works, we know that there is current sheets that flow in the ionosphere, but we also know that the Earth itself acts almost like a capacitor. There are currents that flow deep underground.
I just pulled this up. In recent months, a mysterious tower resembling Nikola Tesla's Warden Cliff Tower has appeared outside of Milford, Texas. And that's out there, right? So there's you guys are what you're talking about is there's companies now starting to tap. It looks like, again, I'm a layman looking at this from the outside, right? But it looks like this is starting to become a thing. It isn't this idea of electric universe, and certainly this would be unlimited power, right?
It's got to be a thing, because if we don't, we're going to have up to 12 billion people on this planet. That's the expected calculation. So they're all going to want phones and electric cars, and they're going to want light bulbs in their houses, just as anybody would. Anybody would want to have the first world standard of living. And so where are you going to get it? Are you going to continue to destroy mountains and arable land in order to get at electricity, or are you going to do it the smart way? And in fact, if we do this correctly, you can make more of a profit, because you can charge for the service and for the maintenance of the grid rather than the cost of fuel. So you're reducing the overhead and just getting straight to the. They already own the grid, right? You can't go out and just clamp a coil on your power lines and go, I'm getting inducted electricity. Okay, it's illegal.
They get pissed about that.
Yeah, you could do it physically, but you can't do it legally. That does happen in third world countries. People do that because it's the smart way to get electricity. But in the future, they're still going to control the grid, because they're the ones with all the money. So instead, we just need to teach them the smart way of getting at this, and then we will have more than enough energy to go to space. There are already designs for electromagnetic launching and get away from rockets, because nobody wants to take a flight to China where they can expect 1% of the time you might explode like the Columbia. Or the Challenger. Okay,
right.
You're gonna want to go on a super, electromagnetic launch. That's the one that's going to be the smoothest. It's going to be the most Absolutely right. There is tons of energy still contained within the Earth that hasn't been gotten at. Not to mention all of the standard alt methods such as geothermal and turbine, and there's smarter ways to do wind. All of these are leading us away from, again, what Tesla described as the barbaric way of getting energy. And on top of that, it's going to lead towards where we'll finally achieve energy levels strong enough to actually protect our planet, because asteroids are becoming, again, kind of a concern. I mean, they're always a concern, but lately there's been a number of really dangerous ones and I don't know if we're going through a new cluster or if it's where we're moving, in the galaxy or what's going on there. But people are starting to get a lot worried, and our species has, as I said, we have a complex surrounding these cataclysms. We don't want to go into this blind, and then we'll start treating each other badly. We should just get with what the problem is. The problem is
you were right. You
space.
Said we have a society that's built almost entirely on the concept of scarcity and supply and demand. And these kinds of things. And this has been, Shifu, and you've heard me bitch about this. And Gareth, I kind of want to get your opinion on this, because as an engineer, the way I see the world is this: there's already no problem on this planet that systemically affects society that we can't already technologically fix. The problem that we continually run up against is that cost basis justification. It sounds barbaric, but it's the truth. Like, we can desalinate water, we just can't do it cheap enough. So we don't have a water shortage problem. We have a desalinization and filtration problem, and it all keeps coming back to the same equation. And that equation is the cost of energy per kilowatt hour or per watt or whatever it is. So to me, it just seems like the utopian goal for us as a society, we have to generate enormous amounts of condensed, very condensed green power, power that doesn't pollute, and make that available to humanity. And if we could fix that problem, it seems to me like the vast majority of the other societal problems we have would just kind of fix themselves by consequence. So I would just kind of like to get your feeling on that.
In some ways, yeah.
I kind of, for me, I think the problem stems with capitalism. I think that causes the industry to want to make more. People are driven to buy new things. We don't live in a society that keeps things. Our society more and more is driven to wanting the latest, wanting the newest. Heck, they even design things so that they don't last. Your washing machine doesn't last 5 years anymore. It's only designed to last 2 or 3. And that's incredibly wasteful, because what happens to that old machine? Well, you have to send it to the dump. Someone might take it apart. That all costs energy. If you were to design a society, and I don't think you can do this, but if you were to design a society, wouldn't you remove all of those things? If you want a washing machine, I just want a washing machine. It doesn't have to look a particular way. It might be nice if it fits in with how I decorated the house. But that washing machine, if it lasts me 30 years, what difference does it make?
Here's what I'm predicting is that when we go into space, when we seriously go into space, let's say that we go to try to harvest that asteroid or comet that has $20 trillion of platinum on it. But you can't just inject all that at once. That would crash the platinum market. And so what we're going to have to do as a species is engineer new markets. And I mean new, totally different. You can't just have one world stock exchange. You're going to have parallel systems where they're exchanging with each other, but not necessarily across the platform, so that there will be industrial economy, and that will be existing separate from our standard day-to-day living economy. And what that will do is take the burden off of governments to create GDP through consumerism. You understand? Because people aren't going to want that much consumer. In fact, we need a little less, because consumerism is directly tied to obesity. There's no way you can get around it. More people consume, the larger they're getting, and that means their DNA is degrading, and that means the intelligences are degrading. So we have to engineer a medical way out, and it's becoming way too expensive for the insurance companies to provide. And so what do we need to do? We need to get away from a model where the U.S. And of course the world, because everybody's tied through the dollar, is driven to grow at a certain percentage rate, or it all depression, and get into a place where there's an even exchange, sort of like bartering, but more obviously better. Money is good in that it is a way to capture potential energy and store it in your pocket for a long time. That way you don't have to trade a cow right now.
Well, maybe that, Shifu, maybe that's what you're hitting at here. Maybe that is not to go all conspiracy theory on this topic here, but from what you're saying, let's say that somebody, a scientist or a research group, did come up and say, hey, do you guys know that we can just produce enormous amounts of rectifiable electricity super cheap? If you were to introduce a technology like that into our world system, it would have global economic ramifications extremely rapidly, right? So, do you think that there's a suppression effect to any of this?
Yes, because and the way I would do it, at least the goal with Test Lab, which is very slow in its progress. But the goal is to create something and then put it out for lease so that, we control the intellectual property, because you cannot freak out the system. If you freak out like response, it'll be sort of like an allergy response. You can't do that. But what you can do is provide people this idea. They go out, they create these generating, and then slowly everyone starts entering into an alternative grid. It's just like the internet. Once you get into the alternative media, you don't need the regular media. But you see what's happening. The regular media is freaking out. They are forcing YouTube to come down on the alternative, because if you look at the topics of the trending on YouTube, for example, the top trending videos, 95% of them, they are getting 5% of the views. The alternative people, you're getting the majority of the views, because people want free and more or less information, or at least bias in the direction that they're interested in, and not in what's the agendas. So when you do that with electricity, if you freak out the system, they're going to come down. So we got to do it nice and slow and bring it into normalcy, to where, okay, it's totally normal that your house is 90 generated. That would be normal, but that's okay, because then the majority of electricity that they generate can go to industry, and that is not a problem.
Yeah, that's that's what I'm getting at, because really at the end of the day, I think all we're talking about, and it's a big all, but is that this really just affects one specific vertical of industry, and power generation is that. All other industries, the vast majority of GDP producing industries, would benefit significantly, and so would society at large would benefit from this. So that's the stark contrast that this kind of data sort of starts to draw, right?
It also would affect, even go beyond industry. We're talking reunification of religions, not directly, and obviously some religions are just not going to get along, but all of them have their start in seeing plasma electromagnetism at play in the sky. So when you start actually bringing that back to bear, people will naturally, over time, start moving away from adversarial approaches to seeing the force, and they will start look at how powerful Star Wars was.
Yeah, I was going to say, it really
united everybody.
Makes Taoism all of a sudden start to make a lot more sense, doesn't it?
Yes, but it takes away the cultural, because the one barrier for the Taoism is that it's Chinese, And people say it's Greek to me, but what they really should say is it's Chinese to me, because when you say anything Chinese to people, their eyes gloss over. So, but Star Wars was the Taoism for the West,
right?
And so there is this ubiquitous force, and there's a journey that you can go on. And I'm talking obviously pre-corporate, pre-Disney Star Wars here. I'm talking the original kind of stuff that set the world on in interest. It had all the mythology. It had everything going in it. This creates an ability for people to talk about some of the same stuff. They might have different, and that might create barriers. It might create conflict and tension. But at least if there's no lack, and there's no way to say that there's lack, if there's no way,
right? Yeah,
your group is taking from my group. Then now we can have an even exchange,
right.
And we can have different cultures, and we can have
right.
Kind of interaction with each other without the threat, and that would be a huge coup. And it might take hundreds of years. Okay, we are just now at the beginning of seeing how we could harvest this stuff.
So Gareth,
I think there's.
Go ahead,
yeah,
buddy.
Sorry, I was just going to say in terms of what you're talking about, that I don't think it's just one vertical. I think, it is power generation in that industry, but don't forget where that power comes from. The fact that we mine the oil, and therefore the countries where the oil comes from, there is vested interests in terms of military and governments, and so I don't think it's as easy as just simply going, it's just one vertical that's affected. I think there will be huge pushback from those.
Yeah, if you could, and I've worked in a lot in energy generation, like all external combustion engine stuff. I do control systems for a living, okay? And I got to thinking about this one day, and I was thinking that if for some reason you could just figure out like cold fusion or fusion, like the Chinese are working on, or efficiently separating hydrogen or whatever it is, there are entire countries that could be thrown into complete chaos very rapidly from that, to the point where militaristic dictatorships already reside in these countries, extremely oppressive regimes. And if you throw an enormous amount of poverty, not that there isn't, because all that wealth and power seems to always be consolidated in a very small group in those countries anyway. But if you take away their cocaine money, so to speak, then bad things are going to happen after that. Bad things
are going to happen anyways. Here's one of the things. It is a fact that the United States military has already done this. There's probably good evidence that they've been doing electrokinetic work since Brown in the early 1900s, right? Which is our other. By the way, there's another electric universe beyond project, and I want the readers to understand there's more that isn't even yet been brought into the standard plasma electromagnetic cosmology. So there's evidence that they've been working on this stuff. We see it in the Stealth B-2 bomber, which is a much improved version of the F-115A in that it is quiet. And so how is it achieving this quietness, and why is it shaped in the way that it's shaped? There is some good evidence that they are already trying to use this electrokinetic drives, and not to say anything about who might be behind the UFOs. So there is already going to be motion in this direction. The neat thing, and here's what I would predict there, is that when at first, yes, mankind is going to point this stuff at each other. They're gonna have space cannons and space lasers and all that stuff. But at some point, that introduces a defensive line. We might need that, because asteroids and comets and these grade 6, 7, 8 catastrophes, they come along, they could be a game changer. And at that time, I think you'll see humanity start to sober up, or at least want to help each other.
Yeah, you would think so, right?
Yeah, you would think. There are always, there were some awful people that after the 2004 tsunami were saying, that the Indonesia deserved it because of the religion, blah blah blah. But the reality is, most of the world, most of the good people, their hearts poured out, and they donated, and they tried to help. What disturbs me, Matt, isn't that how there were a few shitheads that after the 2004 Tsunami Act. It's the fact that in 2018 there was another tsunami, and Indonesia still did not have a tsunami detection system in place.
Yeah,
that's what disturbs me. It's a tendency of humanity to not only be behind the curve, but then still slow to kind of interact. That's where we have in the West acquired, and in the Far East acquired, massive amounts of IQ and technology, and it's clustered in very small places, like Silicon Valley, and it's not penetrating to places like Appalachia. Okay, when I was just in Appalachia, my wife is from Appalachia, and there is not clean water in Martin County. You have to buy bottled water there. This is in America.
Yeah, it's scary. Yeah, it really is.
There is no reason why we can't have gray water systems that are powered by a self-sustaining alternative energy system set up in every home in Appalachia. And the great thing about that is that if there was a gray water system, they would no longer be dumping their sewage because many of them do, into the creeks, go into the river, which goes to the Ohio River, which then ends up in the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
Right. Which means it goes to the ocean. So if they're no longer dumping into their creeks because they have society and it's set up, not only have you created GDP by building these systems, but you have solved the health issue, and you've also fixed things for the amphibians and the fish, and you have to dredge the creeks out to get rid of all the runoff, but you can restore the creeks back to how they were 100 years ago, which was fishable with trout and everything. Okay, that can all happen as it flows downstream from alternative energy. But so long as we maintain a coal-based society, it's not going to.
So Gareth, your channel on YouTube is called See the Pattern, right? So talk to me a little bit, sort of how do you go about, bring this information out? Obviously, the name is See the Pattern, so you're showing correlation here. I'm guessing on your channel between different things and stuff that people wouldn't necessarily connect together, correct?
Well, for me, it all started when I first started looking at the electric universe idea. There was almost so much information, it was very difficult to actually digest and make sense of it. So from that, the concept was born to build sort of my journey through that discovery, and hopefully by doing that, then others would start to see the pattern that I had started to see. Because when you look at a lot of this stuff, they refer to certain things like, when I was watching videos, they were referring to Hannes Alven's galactic circuit. And I was like, well, what the hell's that? And where does that come from? And where do I find any information on that? And it was really difficult to find it. They use terms and they refer to terms and they don't really make it clear what it is. So I kind of set about this vision to try and, I kind of started this because it was actually my dad who I was kind of talking about the electric universe, and I was saying how amazing it is and it changes all these things. And he's like, well, I don't believe it. Where's the proof? Tell me about it. And I was like, so I kind of thought I want to document this. I want to put together a list of resources and links to documents that kind of, it's not irrefutable, but at least it starts to build a pattern that when you start looking at all these things, you see these things repeating. And certainly from being in education, one of the things the way that you teach students is on a repeated basis. As they grow up, the same themes repeat, but they become more and more complex. And that's kind of what I'm finding as I'm digging deeper into this stuff. I'm starting to see connections between things that people say that are, very disparate, but actually when you bring them, so that for me was what it was all about. And how do I come up with the ideas for each week? It's really weird because it's almost like the way a river flows, or if you pour water, it meanders, and there are things that pop up as I'm doing my research, and I think, oh, I don't know about this. I need to do some research on this. And once I build enough stuff, I'm kind of like, oh, that's actually a concept for a video in itself. And then from that, I start the work, and it always seems to kind of flow. It kind of changes direction sometimes, but there always seems to be something that I'm kind of like, oh, I need to know this, and therefore that will be a video.
Yeah, that's actually a good place for a small advertisement. I want people to understand that our community needs more people to do research, and you don't have to be a trained physicist like Gareth or an engineer like myself, because there is so much. When you get into this, I swear you will absolutely find some place where it has an impact, or it sparks something, and I use that word as a pun, but it will open avenues in your mind and in your life. For me, I was doing the research for the Hidden Kentucky project on native stuff. I wanted to know more, and I had learned something that I did not know, which is that the archaeology community actively keeps the public in the dark about publicly owned sites in America, at least. And the issue was that I had all these books, and so I went and I looked in the books, and boom, there they were. Dr. Anthony Peratt's plasma glyphs were in these books in Kentucky. There was evidence. So I just started looking right around me, and I found a Thunderbolt site that is a mile wide, and it's 20 miles from where I sit right at this moment. And I found electrogeology in Kentucky. So I would challenge the people to do what Gareth has done. Look for the pattern and start doing the research. You will suddenly have a stream of consistent information. And then if you do following the science news, like Matt's done here, you can't mistake it. They are putting out so much of this stuff. I mean, it's hitting meteorology. It will come into play, of course, computing. That's a whole area that we haven't talked about yet. Is the direction of the competing versions of the next wave of computers. Imagine if you're have been famous rich people who were poor. Some of them even slept on park benches. So if you're one of those people that is like, I'm going to make my millions. I don't know how, but I'm going to make my millions. Then just think about this. There are huge computing markets that have not yet even been invented. They've been visualized, but they haven't actually come into existence yet. And there's a whole revolution of computing that is coming. And a person could make their mark on that. Just by getting involved in this, they'll find the avenues. And again, because you enter the electric stream, that's where all of our power in our modern culture has come from. Everything about our first world standard of living is owed to the electromagnetic revolution, starting with the light bulb. And going forward, it's probably only going to become more likely that whether it's the space age or living on Earth or living under the ocean, maybe there will be cities under the ocean. I don't know. They have mega city designs where one building can hold 500,000 people. So people being involved in that, even if you are a blue collar worker, you can only benefit from understanding how this stuff works. Whether you go and get a certification and become an electrician, that's not really even jejune to the issue. The issue is, will you join into a current of growing power? Because I think that it's going to basically determine how economies move in the future. I think we will get away from consumerism eventually. I don't know exactly when that would be. The more people that take the time to educate themselves, how does my smartphone work? It's going to only benefit everyone that we go in that direction. If you happen to be interested in mythology, if you happen to be interested in electricity, then the electric universe definitely has a place for you. And one of the best places to start that I know of is Gareth's channel at See the Pattern. I also have the Gateway for people to go and learn. That's why I created it, and it's going to be getting a facelift to WordPress in the near future. So
there's supposed to be a podcast coming too.
Oh yeah, well, you're killing me. I have been so busy. I have newsletters are up. All right, they're coming out every month.
Yeah.
But and there's like plenty of videos there. I mean, there's a whole video series that Wall just did, Gaia, and those are really good videos. You do have to pay the $1 for 2 weeks access or whatever.
Oh yeah, my wife's been geeking out. She's seen that stuff. She's been watching that stuff on Guy, and she goes, "Isn't this the stuff you?" I said, "Yep."
There you go.
What your husband's doing down in his studio, talking to people. Hey, Gareth, I'm looking at the See the Pattern channel here on YouTube, and one of the things I want to kind of point out, and I'd love to get both of your guys' input here, is this is what's interesting about what you guys are doing, and all of the cosmology and electric universe people. You guys allow comments on your videos. This isn't like you're proselytizing from a milk crate or standing on your soapbox or whatever. This is open for discussion. You guys are openly going, hey, here's what I'm saying. Here's the comment section. Tell me, you're kind of like, tell me where I'm wrong, or let's have the discussion. That's really where you guys are coming at from this. And when I talk to people that are outside this community, so to speak, one of the reactions that I get from them is that they sort of always take this topic and throw it in the same box as the Anunnaki or ancient aliens, or it's always thrown in like with that, like there's some kind of woo factor to this. But that's not the case here, right? I mean, you guys are putting white papers together, you're citing your sources, you're going back and like connecting all of this information together together, and then you're putting it out there in a format that says let's argue about it, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
no, exactly. Yeah. I mean you open yourself up. Obviously, there are people who, and with anything like this, you develop strong opinions. People are polarized in one direction or another. But in all of these things, there is a middle ground, and that's very much, in a lot of my videos, I'm open to saying that I don't know. There are certain things that we don't know, and there are certain things where you would question, how does it fit into the electric universe? How does the electric universe explain this? But only by having that debate, only by being open to the current model and potential alternative models, will we find the middle ground. And I do believe that it is a middle ground in some senses, maybe not all of the time. But if you don't have that debate, and it has to be like a proper debate,
for real,
you sometimes you get people who are just
just
very much black and white.
I just finished watching that. If you guys haven't seen it, it's awesome. There's a documentary on Netflix about the flat earthers. Okay. And it sort of follows them and the experiments they're running. And of course, guess what conclusion they keep coming to. But one of the things that happens in there is there was a scientist, a man that was in it, that was at one of their conferences. And he come out and he said, we've got to stop doing this, where we take people and we say, oh, you guys are a bunch of quacks or weirdos, and we're just gonna put you off to the side, because inadvertently, whether these theories have been proven already or not, or however that comes down, a lot of these people are actually doing real science and doing real research. And even if all they're doing is reproving an accepted sort of paradigm, at least they're doing that, and these things should be constantly challenged. And so, do you find that in academia that they get so ideologically locked in their white towers that now we've seen this obviously in archaeology, and Shifu, I'm sure, could do 2 hours on that, right? But and when it comes to the sciences like the physics and this kind of stuff, are they ideologically open to having these paradigms changed, or are they just so rigid that that's why it's taking so long for this kind of stuff to get accepted more?
I think they're very much rigid. I think part of the problem is that it's back to this idea of the way that our economy works. It's very much driven by funding, and the way you get funding, a lot of the time it's sponsored by industry, so money comes in that direction. So there is a bias in terms of what they want to see. And that means that if you try and present an idea which is too alternative, then they'll look at it and go, well, you're never going to get funding for that. And that's become worse and worse and worse. If we go back to like the 19th or 18th century, then the way that you did science in those days was based on the fact that you were potentially wealthy or people sponsored you to do it. And therefore, you could do whatever you liked. I mean, you still had issues. That there are still stories of people undermining other people's work. But I think it's got so bad in our society nowadays that it is difficult for people to come up with ideas which are different to the mainstream and have funding accepted. Particularly, I think, in the US and Western society. I think if you look at China and places like that, they are a lot more open to this idea of an electric universe. And certainly if you look at the papers that they're producing, they tend to be more in line with that. And certainly some of the satellites they're launching and the research that they're doing in based on their telescopes is more in that direction. That is not to say that we are not doing it. So there are indeed those fringe researchers who are doing it, but they have to be covert. So again, the way that a lot of them do it is they don't directly say this is electric universe. They talk about plasma, or they talk about dusty and then the magnetic fields, and you have to read between the lines to see that that means that's an electric current that's flowing.
I saw this the other day, just a couple podcasts ago. We were talking about how there's this new information that supposedly proves Hawking radiation, but they were using what were they? They were using water or something. And so Eric and I, another guy that's on my show all the time, we were laughing about that because it's not analogous. Water and gravity are not necessarily analogous to each other per se. So, but Shifu kind of goes off on this too about how people are building experiments just for the sake of having experiments at this point, and not putting any kind of research or time into things that we know should be pursued per se. But
I wanted people to know where I put the blame for the whole flat Earth thing is in public education, because you can pass your science classes in high school with minimal attention paid, and not being, really keyed into what's going on. Kids are coming away with a misunderstanding of our history, science-wise. And so it's good that they're going and doing these experiments and coming to the natural conclusion, because actually mankind's known that the world's been around for about probably 13,000, 14,000 years. Only certain ignorant pockets of our history have we thought that it's flat, but no one seriously who is an educated person like a ship's captain actually thought that. All right, maybe the people rowing the boat for them, but the reality is most of the world knew that the Earth was round, and many societies, India, China, Egypt, Greece, made calculations about the diameters. So you have people, and they are going to go and do their own science, and they're going to come to only certain conclusions. Now, there is a way of tricking yourself. There's a sort of a famous, internet famous video of a guy teaching relativity, gravity to these kids. Now, here's the funny thing. He's using a bowling ball on a sheet. That means he's using Newtonian.
Yeah, I've seen this experiment, yep.
Right. Yep. He's using Newtonian gravity to prove relativity, which is you can't do that. It's a no-no. And then secondly, he disproves the gravity when he does it, because in the experiment, naturally, what do all the balls do? They fall into the center. They don't wander around in a circle endlessly, or an ellipse. So you've got to take the time, and when people do those experiments, point it out. If you see somebody trying to prove dark matter using water, say, "Hey, this isn't logical," and explain to people what the fallacies are. Because if they can see it themselves, then they'll understand. They may not like it. I lost a friend because of explaining to him about the black hole lie, because I showed him the actual image, the actual radioscope image, and he could see for himself at the time. This is pre-M87, that there was no hole center of the signal. It was a blob. I said, so here's how it really works. They get this signal. They punch it into a model. They crawl a whole bunch of different equations to see which one it matches up. If it comes up that one of them can predict this radio signal, then boom, they proved a black hole exists. So that consequentially, we have dozens of black holes within the Milky Way, which obviously most people that are paying attention would go, hey, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that there could be millions of these black holes floating around in the Milky Way. There must be something else going on here. There's something generating these radio signals. Of course, we call those Z pinches or Bennett pinches, but there is a mechanism happening, and there's results. And so you just have to step through and not only apply Occam's razor, but look for these logical fallacies, such as using Newtonian gravity to prove relativity. And a lot of people don't even know that relativity, honestly, actually started as an electromagnetic thing in the first place. Poincare, he postulated that there would be gravity waves, and he also did Lorentzian transformations of Maxwell's equations to come up with the famous E equals mc squared. He had it differently ordered, but he was coming up. Now that idea itself goes back to the 1880s. It way pre-existed Einstein coming along. So there's a history too. And if people are history buffs, then there's more than enough context in history to study to go, oh, okay, so that's what's happening here. Plasma cosmology has been existing or even pre-existing, depending on which date you start with, quantum and relativity theory. And then when you get to plasmoids versus black holes, they similar era of when they start. I think the difference is the plasmoids have a laboratory base. So, Bostic was doing experiments in lab on these things, and he was describing what we are seeing at M87 and SGRA. In fact, I think there's some pretty exciting news about SGRA that Gareth has covered.
Yes, sorry, Sagittarius A. I thought you were talking about that. I thought you were going to talk about some fusion reactor, because indeed, obviously, plasmoids is one of the concepts to get fusion reactors working. But yeah, I mean, Sagittarius A, if we're talking about, plasmoids and stuff like that, because I know on your show a while ago, you had Neal on and you talked about M87. And, if we look at M87, we're very lucky in terms of the fact that when we look at that galaxy, we look from effectively looking down on it. So looking down on the spiral. Whereas if we look to the center of our Milky Way, we're looking down the arm through the center. So it's a lot harder to see it. And we certainly, if we were able to see it, we wouldn't see that circular ring, if there even is a circular ring. But what's interesting is that there are a couple of pieces of news that have happened about Sagittarius A. The first, which I covered probably about 4 or 5 weeks ago, is the fact that, and this has actually been known for a while, there is a gas cloud, when they imaginatively named it the G2 gas cloud, which was approaching the supposed black hole at Sagittarius A. And this is back in, I think it was 2015, when they first kind of spotted this thing happening. And all the scientists were like, wow, this is magnificent. We are going to capture for the first time ever our Milky Way, our black hole, feeding on some gas. And over the years, they followed this thing, and they were expecting this gas cloud to, obviously, as it approached the black hole, they were expecting it to be stretched out. And then as it approached it, some of it would be swallowed up and some of it would be flung out at a much greater speed. But in fact, what happened was quite the opposite. This little gas cloud just kept going. And then when it approached the black hole, it kind of slowed down and then it kind of turned the corner, which is completely what they didn't expect. And obviously, they then had to come up with a new theory as to why that would be. And then they came up with this idea that there is this super hot gas surrounding the black hole, the accretion disk, which has the same sort of density as our atmosphere, so not particularly great. And they kind of thought that what was happening was that this gas cloud was being slowed down by that gas cloud, which, if you think about it, doesn't make an awful lot of sense, because it would still, if it's gravity that's affecting it, you would still expect it to be accelerated, and you would expect something to happen with it.
So it can bend light, but particles of dust just hangs it up. Can't get past them particles of dust, magically, right?
Yeah, and actually, and when you look at it, because they also have, in that video, they show you some of the stars. I don't know if you've ever seen that. The stars that move around Sagittarius A, they orbit. And obviously, they orbit quite quickly, comparatively speaking. And if there really truly was a black hole at the center, because you can see these stars, imagine you've got a dot right in front of you, the stars would orbit from in front of this dot to the back of it and then round again. So they're going in all sorts of orbits. And as they cross the black hole, both in front and behind, you would expect there to be distortion. If this thing is a supermassive black hole, then it should be creating gravitational distortion, and you should see the classic lensing effect, which you don't. When you look at this video, you see these stars quite merrily going up and down and around, and there's no distortion whatsoever.
That's right.
in that image. And then just recently, and this was just, I think, last week, they used the ALMA telescope to detect hydrogen emissions coming from a giant gas cloud around Sagittarius A. So you have to imagine that this, whatever the object is at the center, is surrounded by some sort of an accretion disk, some dust cloud that we can detect, some plasma cloud. And then outside of this, so that dust cloud at the center is maybe sort of the size of our solar system. And then this gas cloud that surrounds it, that they've just detected, is about, 40 or 50 times the size of our solar system. So it's significantly large gas cloud. And what's interesting is this gas cloud is significantly cooler. So where the one that they detected that they claim slowed down this gas cloud is at 10 million degrees. And again, if it's at 10 million degrees, why don't we see it? But that's a different question. This one that they've detected around the outside is only at 10,000 degrees. Now, in order for us to detect it, there has to be hydrogen emissions, and that means that you're exciting the electrons in the hydrogen and therefore causing it to jump state. And if that is happening, it is highly likely that the gas itself is being ionized. And just to give you an indication, it only takes 0.01% of that gas to be ionized for it to be able to conduct electricity. So it is highly likely that this gas is actually a plasma. What was even more interesting about what they did is they actually analyzed the gas using the Doppler effect, and were able to detect the motion of the gas towards us and away from us, so red and blue shift. And in the image, they show blue dots and red dots where this gas is moving towards us and moving away. And when I looked at this image, what was really striking is that there are pairs of red and blue, red and blue, red and blue, which to me indicates some sort of circular motion going on around the edges of this cloud, which, in classic plasma universe would be some sort of a torus showing the movement of these particles inside of this, Birkeland currents, some sort of flow of energy. And then if you looked at the center of this image, even more striking is where the Sagittarius A sits. There is the plasma plumes downwards and creates like an L shape. So there's like an L that sits underneath it. Now, obviously, we don't really know whether that's moving towards us, whether the Birkeland current is actually moving away or towards us. We only know the relative motion depending on where it kind of sits in relation to the black hole. But that clearly indicates that something is moving into or moving out of that central structure, which again is what we would expect in an electric universe. We would expect there to be sort of a filament structure that connects these things together, that is the driving flow that provides the energy for that central engine.
Yeah, and I want to piggyback that with to help people understand. There are the classic black hole. Because I took my kids to the East Kentucky Science Center, and there were two videos that played. One was all about the IBEX mission, which was full of references to plasma and electromagnetism and particles, and it was very sciencey. It was a NASA video. And then the other one was put out by the University of Denver, and it felt like a propaganda film because it would refuse to mention electromagnetism and refuse to mention plasma. It kept calling it gas and everything. Okay, now so if you talk about the classic black hole, that has basically died. There is no evidence for the idea that light goes in and never comes out. There's almost everything coming out of these black holes these days. Now they have alternative models that have been come up with over the years. There's perhaps more than a dozen of these different models. Those are the ones that they're actually looking for. And so what he's saying is that there were these multiple versions of black holes that they were looking, and the behavior was being predicted along a certain path, and it just didn't happen. It just didn't happen the way that they expected. Instead, it has behaved more like an electric generator. And we see that already in the Crab Nebula. So it's not like we shouldn't have expected it. We seem to keep finding examples of this kind of double reverse bell shape. Some of these very famous nebula, like the Eye Nebula, actually, as it turns out, they already know this too. They have a three-dimensional model based on the redshift. When you actually look at them, they're always these double bell shapes. Even some of the more famous strange ones, the like big X's, kind of square-like shapes coming out of them, it's all due to perspective. This double bell repeated shape where they're facing away from each other is predicted by a gaseous explosion. And it's certainly not something that is standard for black hole theory, at least classical theory. But it is 100% standard for electromagnetism. There's some even very famous visuals provided by David Lapointe, if people want to look him up on YouTube. And he's using plasma and magnetism. He's not even hardly talking about electricity. And he has a whole series of magnetic experiments that where he actually creates specialized magnets, because they can do this these days, specially shaped magnets, using these bowl shapes, and the interactions that they have are really, really very fascinating. And that is the almost ubiquitous thing that we are seeing throughout the cosmos. On top of that, these galaxies are lining up kind of end to end, although there's no end, right? They're spirals, but they're lining up like they're on some kind of string, and they're really far apart from each other. And even more fascinatingly, and something that absolutely cannot be predicted using gravity alone, not even gravity with dark matter and dark energy, there is a certain type of galaxy that all of them in the universe that we can see spin at exactly the same rate and in exactly the same direction. So this is a really fascinating aspect of the plasma electromagnetic cosmology, and a way to connect these things that has never been done before. And these are mainstream articles. They come out, but they somehow never make it into the more like propaganda pieces of the documentaries. Instead, they go constantly back to showing you a bowling ball, but they use the Earth or the sun sitting on a fabric. It's an arbitrarily organized fabric centered around our North Pole, and that doesn't make any sense either, because we are at a tilt as compared to the sun and its rotation. And on top of that, our magnetic pole is all the time changing directions. There are now not only pole flips, there are these things called magnetic excursions, where the magnetic poles kind of go on a little drive around the planet and then reorganize themselves, and they happen much more often than the pole flips. For
somebody that lives in the world of Newtonian physics, that works and exists in that world, this isn't a competing ideology or theory per se, right? It's something that sort of needs to dovetail or fit into that existing paradigm. So there's not a challenge here. So what's the bridge that gets us there for someone that doesn't have a fundamental understanding of electron flow and hole flow and all of these kinds of things?
I think the first thing to realize is it's almost like a layer on top. It's not that we're replacing gravity with something else. Gravity clearly exists. You see it every day. You drop something on the floor, that is due to gravity. What you have to realize is that on a much bigger scale, when we scale it up to the size of planets, to the size of galaxies, the electrical effect is far more important than we ever thought. The fact that these magnetic fields are rotating around the galaxy and the sun has to have an effect on all of those charged particles. And again, it is understanding that the more that we look into space, the more that we see that space isn't empty. It is filled with plasma. It is filled with these charged particles. So they have to experience a force due to these magnetic fields. Now, how do you bridge that gap if you're kind of more used to the Newtonian side? And I think that is to start quite simply. Look at the simple things that you will have done at school in terms of electricity, the fundamental concepts of the generator and the motor, and the fact that they are the same thing. Take a motor and twist it, and you generate electricity. Yes. So
I would also ask that people, again, getting in touch with their history, download on the internet the Hawkins electric field guides, because Hawkins created those field guides. Not only are they beautiful and a great piece of history, but at that time there was no plasma cosmology to speak of. So everything that he's basing on, his mind was a Newtonian mind, but also augmented with this electromagnetic. So it's a great bridge for anybody who's just trying to understand electromagnetism.
Yeah, there's no fundamental difference between a motor and a generator except for some insulation for efficiency. It's funny because that's the world I work in. You're starting and stopping motors, speeding them up, slowing them down, and you start to understand that there's some physics involved here, that when you slow a motor down, for instance, you send electricity back to the utility. And that has to be accounted for somehow. But I don't know that, because when I talk to people about this, when I go out in my professional life and I explain these kinds of things to people, they look at me like I got three heads. Like, no, a motor's a generator and a generator's a motor. And they're like, no, it's not. It's like, yeah, it really is. It's exactly the same thing.
think about this from a different perspective. In history, the bard or the wizard occupied a very, very, very narrow niche. Right? There was only one Merlin There were a couple of guys who were called, but there was really only one. So they weren't common. And Newton himself was very mystically driven. Tesla was a mystic. These people were rare. But now you exist in a time where we have a saturation.
What do you mean by mystic? Can you expand on that a little bit?
I mean that they literally dabbled in the mystic arts, in alchemy. They were believers in things like the ether and in a supernatural process controlling everything from the beyond. These are things that are documented. It's kind of, some physicists are embarrassed about this aspect of Newton, but actually it was what drove him to be different. When he created calculus, he didn't even really like the calculus, but for him it was just a model. It was just a tool. It wasn't like some way to, like he was speaking the language of God. He was trying to understand things like optics and gravity, and he was needed summation tools, right? He didn't have a calculator, right? All he had was an abacus. So he needed a way to look at the universe, but how he actually personally felt about it was a lot more interesting and for the common person, actually really quite connectable. When you don't belong to a cult of peer-reviewed journals, but you belong to the common society, you need a way to interact with this stuff. And if you look at the history, you will find a lot of belief, a lot of religion. You will find a lot of faith in these men who were trying to interpret something that was well beyond them. Magnetism itself was a mystical force. We see this in the Egyptian hieroglyphs. They use snakes and animals and very interesting ways of depicting this force. Reputedly, the lodestone really fascinated Cleopatra. The Chinese, they had the south-pointing chariot, which was the world's first compass that we know of. And they had a way of describing this chariot, and it's contained in Dr. Joseph Needham's work on science and civilization in China. And they had this feeling that it had like a kind of an intuitive sense of where the South Pole was. Of course, for the Chinese, the South Pole was the more important one. So this stuff is already there, but the difference is that you have a whole lot of people who don't understand it, but they use it every day. And they are still familiar with the myths and motifs. They'll watch Harry Potter all day, and and it's all in good fun, but to some degree people believe it. You would be surprised how many people still have very superstitious beliefs about how it works and how disease works. And so if you give them this connection as to how their light bulbs are performing in their or a fluorescent bulb, and you hold it over a plasma orb and it lights without being plugged into a socket, now you have a bridge to talk about the mythic force and to talk about practical, real science, because we are all becoming...
This isn't self-evident. It's around us, all in manifestation. You can see it, like you said, like a fluorescent lamp is a manifestation. It's not like this is woo or voodoo or anything. It's a legitimate thing we use every day.
Yeah, here's a funny experiment. If anybody owns, let's say you are a real hardcore skeptic and you have even electrical background in your garage, you probably have a voltmeter. Get yourself a plasma orb, a kid's plasma orb. Now, take and make metal foil, lay it around that, turn it on. Now measure the current coming out of that. It's going to spike because if you measure it from just without the foil, what you find is it's almost negligible. But if you put that foil on top, it not only can it burn you, really, I mean, it really can burn right through your skin. It really is amazing. But it will spike out a Cat 3 voltmeter. And this is just a child's plasma orb. So imagine something that's well beyond that. You're talking in there. The currents are just reaching glow mode, but I wouldn't say that it's arcing at a dangerous level. And everybody's house, everybody has breakers. Right. All those circuit breakers are potential grenades. Every single one of them.
In my industry, they've really gotten big on us having to worry about arc flash. It's a huge deal now, and for years now. So what does that mean? That means that if I open a control panel to go plug in my laptop in, let's say to go change a program or whatever it is I'm doing to a machine, depending on the potential that's in that panel, now they're starting to make us put almost like literally spacesuits on just to open a door. Wow. It's gotten to be that big a deal, because you can be, depending on the potential, in the right circumstances, you could be incinerated by what's inside that panel. It's not entirely it's not highly likely that it'll happen, but it does happen enough that it's starting to become a standard that, like I said, that we call arc flash. It's a huge deal. It's funny. It's ironic because I have one of those plasma balls. It's in the studio here. People always come in and mess with it. They love the thing. It just mesmerized by it. Can't stop touching it.
Well, we'll take the one brief moment to mention to people about your circuit breakers. Most people are used to just a general, it's just switching off. Basically, something overloads the circuit. But if you have the breaker, when you flip it back on, it slams back without any buzz or anything. It just slams right back. Do not do that multiple times because you can create an arc flash situation. And we're talking temperatures at the surface of the sun, which is kind of like one of those wink and nod situations where you're like, well, why is the surface of the sun the temperature? Well, because it's electrical. But these situations, I mean, you live with this stuff, and so it doesn't take much if you connect these things together. And I mean, then you are doing what the wizards and the bards have done, except the difference is now everybody being literate for the most part and living with this stuff every day, listening to this using electromagnetism, charging their batteries, driving their cars. You are swimming in it already. And all that it takes is for us to get back on the bandwagon, get back on where things were in the early 20th century, and we'll be right on our way. It'll be a matter of time before we're colonizing Mars and terraforming it at the same time.
But I think it's driven by curiosity. I think, coming back to how do people bridge that gap, there's got to be a willingness. You can't give something to someone and say you must read this. Curiosity drives you to want to learn and understand more. And I think if people are interested, there are enough resources for them to start understanding. Even if you've never understood electricity, because I certainly know from teaching at school, depending on the teacher you get, you either kind of understand it or you're left with this scratching your head. What is the difference between current and voltage?
Yep.
And, the only way you're going to get over that is to start doing your own research and, find something that kind of inspires you. For me, when I went back to teaching and started to learn to teach, Tesla was one of my kind of inspirations. And I built a Tesla coil. And I actually use that in a lot of my teaching to demonstrate different effects, because it is something that people kind of gravitate towards. People are now aware of, who Tesla was, and yet you can use that to demonstrate so many different effects that, visually you can see. It is very hard to explain concepts that you can't see. And electricity, for the most part, we can't see. But there are ways that we can visualize and we can demonstrate what it is. And I think once you start to see some of those connections and see how it works, you start to realize that, everything has an electric field. We have an electric field. The Earth has a magnetic field. And if you start to visualize some of those fields moving, you start to see that there's an awful lot of energy around us.
Yeah, I'm looking through your page here. You reference a lot of people, Velikovsky, and other, who's this? Haynes, Alvin. There's a lot of this stuff that goes back in antiquity that's already been sort of explored, explained, but these physicists and these scientists and these people, they don't get that mainstream sort of what Shifu talks about it too, where it's like this pop culture kind of thing within. We love Einstein, but then you got Tesla, who just got got robbed basically, and is never really talked about. But you're referencing a lot of this work that's already, you're standing on the shoulders of work that's already been done here in your show, right?
Yeah, I mean, my aim was not to, because it's very easy in a lot of these scenarios to make up stuff. You hear a little bit of information and here we go, we roll with it, and some people might buy into it. But for me, it was about, I wanted to understand it. I wanted to deeply understand how some of these concepts work. And for me, the only way you're going to do that is to go back to the beginning. How did this all start? And how did those first pioneers come up with some of these concepts? And those concepts might not 100% work nowadays, but unless you understand that basic mechanism, it's a bit like saying, we follow Newton's laws, but we kind of know that actually they don't always work, but for most of the time they're good enough. And a lot of these original pioneers explain things in a way that I think helps us to understand how the electric universe fits in. And some of the problems I've had when I've looked at some of the general electric universe stuff is that they reference stuff or they mention stuff without really explaining or understanding it. And that was my goal, to try and underpin, well, where does this come from? And if he said this, then what else did he do? What other papers did he look at? And how does that relate to the overall view of how the universe might work?
That really happens a lot too, and I have to be cautious of that, because I think what happens is people sort of talk past the explanation with the assumption that the listener already understands up to this point, kind of thing. And so that's good. So you go through and I'm assuming from what you're saying here is you kind of go through and put those pieces together in some sort of chronological or some sort of structured direction to sort of take the listener from maybe a basic high school type fundamental understanding of physics, and then bringing them through with these historical figures and sort of bring them through to the a more, I guess, enlightened understanding of the subject matter, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. And there are two. So I do like a weekly sort of in-depth, learning session, shall we call it, where I take a particular topic and we kind of explore it, whether it's the galactic circuit or anything like that. And then I do sort of news ones. So I pick a particular story in the news from the past couple of weeks, and then I kind of break it down in terms of, well, what does that mean in an electric universe context? So there are two different ways that you can, and I guess the news one is more speculative, where I'm postulating how certain things could or might occur. And then the other ones are, driven more from hardcore papers and articles that support and explain that concept, and hopefully through kind of that journey of seeing the I guess the theory and then the actual thing, you start to see more patterns, because again, as I said, a lot of it is about repeated things. That the more that I look at this thing, the more I start to see the existence of particular shapes or particular patterns in whether it's nebulas or other things, and you kind of think, well, what causes that? Well, that could be one of these circuits. Oh, that's the galactic circuit. So if that's a galactic circuit, well, where is that feeding from, and what does that mean that comes out on either side? And you start to look at things in a different way, and I think it does help to enlighten you to see that journey. So when people talk about, oh yeah, of course, there's a jet coming out that direction because of this, you're kind of like, that's because of Alvin's galactic circuit,
Yeah, and it goes back to that correlation is not necessarily causality. However, when you start looking at all of this is what got me so fired up about this when I first started talking to Shifu and to Neal, was we're not talking about one or two things here that just happen to happen. There's a lot of evidence for this that points at it from many, many, many different directions. It's not any one or
it's even better than that. It solves, in science, we want to reduce the equation to the simplest parts. It's sort of like why Heaviside, his equations are used instead of Maxwell. It's simpler. And the simpler you can get, the more concise you can get, probably the more accurate the picture, and sometimes even the more precise the picture, which is two different things to say. But in this, we can get accuracy and precision by reducing the number of variables in the equation. A lot of people don't know this, and this is, I would refer people to the work of Stephen Crothers, who has done amazing mathematical work on the Schwarzschild solution to general relativity. And there are actually different mathematical frameworks, not even just the equations, but the actual how it's looked at. It's sort of like the difference between Euclidean and spherical and cylindrical geometries. They are all geometries, but they are arranged differently. And so there are different arrangements for the mathematics between the black hole and the Big Bang universe. And even among the Big Bang, there is a lot of turbulence right now, not only because they relied on redshift measured using earthbound radioscopes, which is a huge problem. It turns out that more than half of the papers on dark matter are probably worthless, because when they actually compare it with Gaia's results, their redshifts are incredibly skewed. Surprise, surprise, right? Because you have the light coming through the atmosphere as it comes into the Earth's atmosphere. But they're also finding things like, I think there was a paper recently released. It was like, there's an extra, billion years old. And that would rewrite a lot of if you go to museums right now, all those considered wrong in the Big Bang. And there's a consistent alteration of this where they're like, oh, whoop, this was wrong and this is wrong. And because of that leaves a lot open when you have a cosmology that basically starts from the premise of, hey, we don't really know, but this is what work has been done. And these are what the myths say, and this is what the science says, and they're pointing to the same thing. When you have a bridge between Chinese philosophies, we know the Chinese were very scientific pre-Han Dynasty. They were some of the first to have systematic chemistry. They had the world's first seismograph. So how did they get there? It's highly doubtful that they were, smoking some kind of drug and doing chants and dancing around the fire and came up with chemistry that is now being shown to have superconductivity in their dyes. They were basing it on some fundamental process. How did they get there? They were systematically observing the universe, and they were systematically doing that because it was important to them. It was a matter of survival. It was a matter of fascination. They were very curious. How did the Egyptians create these giant electrical generating pyramids? Well, they must have spent some time, probably a lot longer than it would take us, but certainly a well-used thousands of years to observe the effects and then notice the effect of piezoelectricity. Did they call it piezoelectricity? Of course not. But they did happen to know that, and that's been verified. We have now science that shows the electromagnetic properties of the Great Pyramid. So again, when you have simplification, that is improvement. And that, at least in my opinion. I don't know if Gareth, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I have a question for you, Gareth. And so where is that? What do you think it's going to take? Let me see how do I want to word this? There's going to be a eureka moment at some point where it looks to me like the evidence is overwhelming, but something's going to have to happen that finally makes that transition where we go, okay, here's got to be the new paradigm because the old one's busted. It's not going to work. If that's to happen, where do you think that's going to come from? Or what particular experiment or observation would need to happen to make that connection where this now gets incorporated into the existing understanding?
I think first of all, it's really important to point out that the electric universe doesn't hold all the answers yet. So this is a theory that is being built on, but there are many, many questions that still need to be answered. And that's, I guess, one of the exciting things about science is the fact that, one question will lead to another question. In order to get to the answers, the problem is there aren't that many people working on it. So you need more people to start researching it for that to happen. For me, I'm not sure that it will occur as a eureka moment. And maybe this is me being slightly cynical, but I suspect that what will happen and we're starting to see that in terms of the way that the mainstream papers are being published, is that mainstream universities will start to adopt some of these concepts, but they will change the name of it. So we're already starting to see a lot more plasma papers being introduced. And I suspect if, wind forward 5 or 10 years, it'll be their great discovery that actually the universe is driven by these plasma flows or whatever they call it. It won't be Birkeland currents. It'll be something else. And it was their idea, not someone else's idea.
It'll be named after the what do you call it? The celebrity physicist of the year or something, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yes. Well, this actually just happened. Gareth had shared a paper, and these guys, I think that they even in the article said that it was the first time it had been done.
Yes.
And I did a cursory search, and there was at least one paper about magnetic filament connections already, and then there were 3 or 4 others that were X-ray observations of filament connections going back to the 1980s. So these guys, why did they think that? They were coming downstream, right? They're young. They're probably young researchers, and so they were not aware of this switch until the last few years, when essentially after the Large Hadron Collider was turned on, they found the Higgs they were looking for, but they did not find supersymmetry. They found the opposite of supersymmetry. Susie didn't predict a single thing, as far as I'm aware. And they quietly said, oh, well, nature doesn't agree, so we have to adjust the model. And that's about all we've heard out from string theory in the last 3 years.
Well, we referenced that quite a bit here in today's podcast, too. We talked about the different models, the standard model, and what's the other one? I always forget the other one. Is that the...
Well, there's MOND. There's MOND, which, again, had a series of catastrophic failures last year. There's a superstring theory. There's some pure quantum solutions. There's actually multiple concurrent solutions in quantum mechanics, and they argue amongst each other. There's, of course, the relativity theory, and then plasma cosmology, and that's the majority of the big names. There's a lot of people that are into unique aspects like the Bose-Einstein condensate. There are these, and then of course I guess you could get outside of the generally accepted, and you have New Earth creationism, and you have the flat Earth people, etc. Realistically, it has boiled down to only the 2. And Big Bang is only surviving as an expansion modification. It's kind of a mutant. It has a lot of things that have been added to it to keep it alive, but it is really struggling right now with the redshift.
Well, I mean, but let's be honest here. I mean, the electric universe does not, as far as I'm aware, have a model for the formation of the universe, and I guess this is where a lot of people have, we as humans like to think...
It's more of a consequence of the universe. Is that what you're saying? Like that's what plasma cosmology is? So it assumes it's already there.
No, it doesn't really have a genesis, really.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem. As humans, we find it difficult to see a concept where something has existed forever. We like to, we live and we die. Therefore, there has to be a beginning and there has to be an end. And that's why the Big Bang is very appealing, because you have a beginning and there are a number of different scenarios for that end. And the electric universe doesn't have it. There isn't a genesis part of that cosmology. It is more and about how the framework works and how things fit together, but it says nothing about how it was created. And there are alternative theories to the Big Bang, which could still apply in a model for the electric universe, because the electric universe says nothing about the size of space. It only talks about how they are connected together and how those structures are formed. Is the universe infinitely large and has existed for an infinite amount of time? Is it finitely large but so big that actually we can't see the edges? Is it constantly being created and removed in other bits? We just happen to live in one bit that, there are many different ideas about how that could work, but they tend to be more, I guess, at this point, philosophically driven.
Yes.
But there are physicists who have worked on this concept whose ideas I think still stand. They just sit in the background now that the Big Bang holds the spotlight for now.
Yes.
Until that is eventually disproven.
Well, I thought that the whole cosmic background radiation was the giant echo thing that they all point to say the Big Bang was
the
real.
Red herring. Yeah, but that's if you look at the science behind how they got to that data, it is farcical how they can say that is evidence of it. And there are other theories that potentially could explain it. So in one of the things that I've kind of uncovered more recently is this concept of plasma redshift, which could very well explain that echo that we see. And if, I haven't actually delved into the depth of it, but if that is true, that explains exactly why we do see this kind of glow all around us and why there is this perception that everything is moving away from us, because it is due to the plasma creating this shift, and therefore things are not moving away from us. They're all in a static universe that is potentially infinitely large. But yeah, there
is something else that again, I would encourage people to Sky Scholar and follow the work of Dr. Robitaille. He has covered background kind of in the done with a specially designed radioscope that was tilted in such a way that the signal coming from water would not be able to easily enter and disturb the signal. And guess what? The cosmic background radiation disappeared. And Robitaille, his specialty is in microwave radiation. He was involved in MRI designs, and he is a current professor at The Ohio State University. He has gone to conferences and explained why Kirchhoff's supposed Kirchhoff's law is not really valid, because it was never experimentally proven. It was postulated and then it was called a law. It was not actually proven. So you have these problems with the cosmic background radiation. And again, Crothers has covered this, where like when they did the WMAP experiment, which led to the famous, see how the universe is structured kind of videos from the late 2000s. The error that was in their data set, the saturation was so strong that they had to combine those results with those of another satellite, both of which would have been potentially influenced by the atmosphere of the Earth. And only by combining those could they create the famous WMAP image that you see propagate the majority of the internet. So if you Google image search for the WMAP experiment, you have to put in original map to see that saturated image, or go find the paper. And again, that bait and switch is a real common problem in science. And I'm not sure if it's at the science. There are some scandals that happen in science with people faking data.
Yep.
Or is it when they talk to the media and they want to interact? There's an entire documentary, for example, where they cover when Houghton Arp discovered the communication between quasars and galaxies. And they postulated that in fact the quasar was coming from the galaxy. Well, he showed those images. He has a number. He has like 300 galaxies named after him. And so when his enemies in his field contacted the media to get it out there, they sent the image that have that bridge in it. And then they got him discredited, and he basically lost his ability to use the telescope there in southern. This bait and switch thing, and we got to watch out for the bait and switch.
Let me come full circle with this, Shifu, and I guess I'll direct this. I'll direct this at Gareth first. We live in an interesting world today where we're seeing accepted paradigms in science being challenged all over the place. Okay. However, there's also sides of science that we should be paying attention to, and we're completely ignoring when it comes to things like, shit you shouldn't be putting in the ground, and, like all of these kinds of things, right? Or vaccinations or whatever, okay? So there's all of this happening right now, and it seems like as a whole, like science is sort of, and from the political paradigm, from the left and right side, science seems to be taking, a beating as well. how do we get that distinction between challenging academia appropriately or challenging accepted paradigms appropriately without throwing out all of the science we need to sort of live and function as a society every day? I mean, have you ever considered this? Like, with the way things that are happening here, it seems to me that there's like these general consensuses being formed by people. It's like, well, if that's wrong, then all of it's wrong. And it's like, whoa, slow down, everyone.
Right. I think part of the problem is media and the way that I guess maybe it's the naivety of some of the reporters and how they report on stories, which, and I guess in some sense, the way that scientists release their papers. I mean, you know, from 1 week to the next, you read a story that, you know, red wine is good for you. And then 3 weeks later, you read it's going to kill you. And that sort of inconsistency.
Exactly. Yeah.
In terms of the way that you would perceive it, you know, reading this article is that they don't know what they're doing. The fact is that if you delve into the detail of the study, and the devil is always in the detail, they are looking at different samples. So it's it's to do with the sample group, or it's to do with what the criteria is that they're looking at. So it could only apply to certain types of people. But the problem is the media portray this, and they just, it just bang, the story goes out, bang, and it's just headlines. And a lot of the time, people read the headlines and don't read the stories. And I remember there's one that I used to teach in my class. There was a headline here that ended up in the Sun paper, and I don't know if you know the Sun paper, but it is a tabloid. And the headline was "New experiment verifies that Wi-Fi can kill you." And they quoted this study that was done. And again, most people read no further than the first paragraph of this article. And in fact, when you read through it and you actually went to the link of the study that was done, it was not done by scientists. It was done by students who were working, they were doing like a study as part of a university. So a school was doing a joint study with a university, and they were looking at plant growth in the vicinity of a Wi-Fi hub. But the problem is that the way they'd done the experiment, there wasn't really any good conditions set up. There were no control variables or anything like that. And in the article, the original article that the students produced, they discussed some of the factors that might have caused the plants to die. And, one of them obviously could be the radiation, but more likely in their conclusion was that because the Wi-Fi requires a power supply that generates heat, and what happened is the plants dried up. So more than likely they died from not having enough water.
Right. In this, so they made no connection between whether Wi-Fi is actually good for you or bad for you or not. They just killed a plant. No, that's all they actually did, kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And in the original study, they talk about that fact, but the newspapers jump on the Wi-Fi kills plant, therefore Wi-Fi kills us.
Yeah, we definitely live in a world, and look, I'm guilty of it too, okay, because when I name my podcasts, I put the catchiest thing, clickbaitiest thing up front, okay, because I want people to listen to the show, right? That's
the consequence of
unfortunately
how things go. Yeah,
that's the world we live in, right? But as another aside from kind of this is that I had this argument. I was on a job site in Florida. I had this argument with a guy one time that all researchers are paid off or something. But it got me thinking about how that kind of all works, though. If I'm a research team, I'm on a research team, let's say, and I'm researching, X theory, and another research team in another country is also researching X theory. There's some really big forces that are at play here. Both from a financial standpoint and from a just an existing standpoint. What I mean to say is it's not in my best interest if I'm on a research team to disprove my theory, because that means my research stops. And then I've got to go find something else to research, number one. Number two, if I disprove a theory, I could be not only putting my entire team out of work, but the teams of my colleagues, friends all across the world. I could be putting them out of work too. So there's a how, I mean, is there a way past this? I mean, how does that happen?
Yes. And what has it always been? The people have to demand better. They have to learn how to discern the difference between quality news and fake news. They have to learn how to discern the difference between quality reporting and fake reporting and agenda-driven reporting. Between quality medicine and fake medicine. You know how many people come into my office and they think they have sciatica? Number one, they don't, because it's not coming from the sciatic nerve. Number two, they either self-diagnosed or they went to a doctor who's not a specialist. Or number three, when they went to that doctor, the doctor did not touch them, did not palpate or auscultate. I just had a patient yesterday. Once again, what they had was anterior pelvic tilt. Okay, so once I cured the anterior pelvic tilt, the quote sciatica went away, and this other doctor had been recommending surgery. So not only because they that's how they make their money, but that's because that to everything when you're a hammer looks like a nail. And
right. So when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, the world starts to look like a nail, right?
The entire like a nail. And that's simply not it. And I have a saying, the truth is in the middle and off to the side a bit. And what Gareth and I advocate is that people find the bridge between things. Gravity is self-evident. The Newton's model of gravity is just that. It's just a model. He himself connection between the two, but he suspected that there was something that did unite them. And the same thing with the electricity, right? At the time of Faraday, he did not have an explanation, but he suspected that there was something fundamental connecting how they all worked. And so we've called that thing a field, and we haven't yet given a perfect or a realistic definition for mass, for a field, for the photon, right? The photon is definitely not a particle, but it is something that can behave like a particle or a wave, depending on which way you're looking at it. So we have more work to do. That's exciting news, but it is bad news for those who want there to be this finality to create. They have an agenda to sell a paper or to sell an idea that is driven towards a tribalistic goal, or maybe a financial goal, so they need people to buy into XYZ program.
We definitely see this sort of
all the time.
Somebody needs, like, there seems to be like a how do I want to say this? Like an institutional sort of ownership of all higher knowledge. It can't come from other places, right? I mean,
even Heaviside ran afoul of the London Historical Society. He ticked them off, and they shut him out. And this is the man. They use his equations, but they don't call them Heaviside equations. They call them Maxwell's equations. They're not Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations are too difficult to use for the vast majority of people. Outside of, once you take the course, you're done using those. Once you do electrical engineering work, you use Heaviside equations. So the institutions, if you run afoul, they can shut people down. That kind of thing. The only way that ends is the people that subscribe to the journals, the scientists themselves, to demand a different way of doing things. To say, well, we have. This is something that's a theme in Jurassic Park in Michael Crichton's book. Dr. Ian Malcolm says, if you always look for something you're expecting, you're only going to find that thing, and within those parameters.
I mean, ideologically speaking, not that this would ever happen, but I think the way the grant system works needs to change. And why don't we have a system? And this sounds maybe a little bit counterintuitive, but for every idea, every theory that someone has, you need to set aside grants for alternative ideas that can be fully researched. Because unless you are open to the possibility that something is wrong or something is different, you're never going to find it. The more that you stick to one path, the more invested you become in that path. Therefore, the only way you're going to be open to alternatives is to make sure that you almost book those so that they're there. They might not go anywhere, but unless you put money into them, you're never going to find them.
Isn't there sort of an inherent force at play here that says, we should take as long as we possibly can to figure this out anyway, because once we do, then the grant money is going to stop, the funding is going to stop.
Yes.
I mean, doesn't that sort of exist here too?
Look at dark matter, 20 years. I mean, how much money have they spent? I mean, it's just shocking.
It is very shocking, and they're now literally inventing new forms of dark matter. They're inventing light that isn't light. They're calling hidden or dark photons.
We're
and
using
they're inventing
water to
negative
prove black
mass.
holes.
Yeah, they're creating.
Oh, they have white holes now as well. Did you know that? White holes?
Yeah,
Magic.
it. Again, though, we have to be careful to recognize that there is a tendency in the human to, because we are spiritual beings, to always look first for the supernatural answer before actually encountering the real answer. And it takes a certain amount of time. In the old days, really only educated people became scientists. And now we're at a stage, and kudos to us, where any high schooler can become a scientist. If they are poor in high school, they may actually kind of blossom in college. They can take remedial courses, which leads to a bachelor's degree, which then leads to a master's degree, and they can get a PhD. And then they are technically called a scientist, but that doesn't mean that they necessarily understand the scientific method. Somebody has to hold their hand for a little bit and explain the difference between proper scientific method and improper scientific method, at least using the Western paradigm of science. There are other sciences that have been designed in the world. They're all based on an empirical observation. We must understand that all of our observations are coming to us through electromagnetic interactions, or so we must suspect most things, like this lensing. Okay, Edward Dowdy, from formerly has come forward and said, "Hey, we've never found microlensing like they've said. You find it at the 1 radius, but not at 2 and 3. And if there were microlensing, it should be all over the place. It shouldn't come from only specific places. We're probably seeing either error or, again, light, which is electromagnetic, passing through plasma, which is behaving electromagnetically, of course, is going to warp those results. We have to suspect what we first see. And that tendency is not as common in the ordinary average person as to assign a specious belief. That is far more common to say, well, it's because of demons or something. You know, that is the tendency.
Yeah.
We have to fight that, because ignorance is the source of suffering. 2,600 years after Buddha, we still haven't learned that lesson.
Yeah. Well,
ignorance is the source of suffering.
I've seen that meme. It says science, because actually figuring shit out is better than making stuff up. You know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a burdensome truth.
Yeah.
You can create a nightmare like the plastic ocean, or you can save lives by getting rid of staph infections.
Yeah.
Same thing though with, you know, like we've discovered bleach can kill bacteria, but what we haven't learned is that competitive natural selection still works amongst bacteria in hospitals. When you wipe out all of the bacteria, only the strong survive.
Well, so
it's a big problem.
That kind of brings me full circle here. As we kind of start wrapping up, guys, because we've been at this for 2 hours, and I super appreciate it, but I know you guys got lives to get back to. But you were talking about bleach kills bacteria, right? Well, I've also seen the articles where they're shutting down alternative health sites because they had people trying to drink bleach to cure AIDS. So what I'm getting at is
God bless.
Oh my word, the world, right? But so what I'm getting at here is that it's interesting that what I think is happening or has to happen is we need to return, because forever we've been rewarded for being ideologically rigid. In other words, our society was kind of based on, if you learned a ton of stuff and got really smart about stuff, you could tend to more easily chart your own financial course in the world. So it was about learning facts and having them internalized. But we don't live in that world anymore. Now we live in a world where I can just Google it and I'm going to get an answer. It might be the wrong answer, like drink bleach cures AIDS, but you're going to get an answer. And somewhere in there, you're also going to get the right answer. So now it's like, the paradigm shift has to go back to, or has to move from, okay, I need to be, know everything, to I want to be able to learn as much as I can, or, returning towards that society of wonder, where how does this work? How does that work? How do I create something? Because the information now is sort of like commoditized. Anybody can get it. You can be a kid in very poor Africa and be if you got access to the internet, you're building windmills to pump water out of the ground and all kinds of strange shit, right?
I think the problem is it's a skill that we are not teaching. So, if I look at my personal experience of teaching, it is all fact driven, and in fact it's got far worse.
But that's the old model, right? That's the problem.
And what it doesn't teach people to do is how do you find out if something is real? What do you have to do in order to, dissect a paper to work out? Because I've read some papers that people have proposed, and blatantly they are lying. They are misusing facts to make it seem like something is true when it is not. And unless you know how to spot those things, you would read it and go, oh, that's the truth, because someone's written it and it looks really formal, it looks really pretty.
Yeah.
And other people have seconded it, but actually it's not true.
I'll give an example of what he's talking about. He could probably explain it more. There's a famous pair of galaxies that don't have any dark matter. There was a paper released last year, kind of middle to late last year, saying, oh, there's no dark matter in these galaxies. That proves that there is dark matter, which is a complete logical fallacy.
Yeah, lack of evidence isn't evidence.
Yeah, a no measurement doesn't mean, maybe you're not measuring it right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thankfully, someone wrote a paper and called them out on it, but it just as many times, I think I don't remember the exact statistic, but it was a high number, like well over 8 out of 10 papers go without any rebuttal or validation. And that is a huge problem in science. But again, Gareth could probably speak to more about this idea about the galaxy, the missing dark matter somehow proves there's dark matter.
Yeah, how do you get to that conclusion? I mean, that's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it?
Well, but then dark matter is counterintuitive. So if you're desperate to look for something and you don't find it, then not finding it is proof their rationale behind saying that not finding it is evidence of finding it is because that implies that not all galaxies have it, and therefore that's fine because that means it's a distributed model. Therefore, some will have it and some don't. Therefore, that proves that it exists. And actually, there's another paper out just, I think, last week or the week before, which disproves that altogether. So now, actually, the reason, because it's all to do with the rotation speed of the galaxy, and depending on how far away it is, new measurements prove that the galaxy is much closer than originally thought. And therefore, the rotational speed of that galaxy now matches what they would expect to see, and I put in quotes here, in the air for a dark matter galaxy. So guess what do they say? That therefore proves that dark matter exists. So it doesn't matter which way you do it, it's always going to prove that dark matter exists.
That sounds much like politics to me, more like politics than science.
There's another problem.
That is the problem with science.
Yeah, there's another problem that we haven't mentioned, which is there's a tendency right now in science that we have to warn young people away from as they become scientists and engineers. You cannot use a pseudoscientific hypothesis and expect to get scientific results. Because if you create a hypothesis that can't be disproven, then you can always come back later and say, well, I constrained dark matter in this range, but that means that there's this entire infinite rest of the range that I have to, they're narrowly constraining out the existence here. Well, I can make a hypothesis that unicorns are running in wild herds around Alaska. And then I take two helicopters and I search Alaska and I go in a clockwise manner to where they're always opposite. And then I can always say, well, when we were at 12 and 6, they were at 6 and 3.
Right.
And then I can continuously ask for funding for my helicopter search for unicorns wild in Alaska. If you create a pseudoscientific origin for something, then you will always be when you falsify it, you'll be able to say, well, when I falsified it, it was because there was a validity problem.
I think part of the problem, because we're talking here really about cosmology, and in one of the videos I did a little while back is how did we end up in this mess in cosmology? And it addresses exactly this problem that we've, for cosmology, gone down a route which is very heavily mathematical based. It's based on assumptions and mathematical models rather than based on, an experiment where you see an effect and then you match that effect to something that you see in the sky. We don't do that anymore. It's all based on ideas and concepts, and those concepts then generate new ideas and concepts.
Yeah, it's all derivative.
So it's like it's all a house of cards. If you pull one of those cards out, the whole thing will come crashing down. Yeah. And they don't want that, so they now protect that above everything else.
Maybe this is another wormhole, but let me throw this one at you guys. Is the answer, and I'm spitballing here, but is the answer to just let these research institutions like universities and stuff actually keep the intellectual property rights of their discoveries?
I don't know, because the ideology, when you get 2 or 3 generations in to being the descendant of a rock star such as a Gilman or Feynman, an Einstein or something like that, the amount of starstruck eyes, what happens is some of these institutions, they produce essentially tyrants. There are some famous or infamous people, like say in archaeology especially, who crushed, let's take the Amazonian example. There was for 30 years a single archaeologist, and she crushed all dissenting opinion that there could never be more than a few thousand people in the entirety of the Amazon.
Totally. Not only is that right, but that's that same problem where she's trying to protect her she's protecting her land, so to speak, her world.
Yeah, right? It was her turf, it was her view, but now you've given power to that very institution to have the ultimate authority. Very famously, Hubble got into a very, very vicious battle. An astronomer who happened to be the head or one of the top at the time, he became the head astronomer at Harvard. Now you have Harvard. Harvard's name is up there with Oxford. I mean, it is almost an impeachable name when it comes to research. So when you have that kind of amazing that Hubble came out of it, the victor, to be honest with you. Velikovsky did not. And it was the same man in both instances, except he had more power. He came around. So I don't think that giving power back to the institutions is the solution.
I guess I don't mean, and the reason I'm coming at this way is, here's what I'm saying. So if you remove the future funding sort of paradigm from the equation, or if you remove that from the equation, and where an institution, if you make a valid discovery, can then profit off of that discovery, which then funds further research for actual discoveries. You see what I mean? Versus where and I hate to say this because I know this has been done like with pharmaceuticals and stuff, but then it gets handed off to a corporation of some sort.
Yeah.
Right?
I don't see, I have a different solution. When you look at the history of science, almost all of the best solutions and stuff, including Einstein in his photoelectric effect, were non-institutional, or they were from individuals who were coming at it from the outside. They were outsiders. Some of them were loners. They were weirdos, crackpots. Some of them never even hold a date.
Yeah, historically speaking, academia has not necessarily been the bastion of all knowledge. It's come from outside sources.
The problem with groupthink is that it doesn't work. I've proven this time and again. I have my students play chess, and we'll play individually, and then I have them get together as a team, and I handily crush them even worse than I would individually. They're terrible at working at a team to discern a proper strategy, and I use that to teach them about the problems.
You're like a weird Zen sadist, Shifu. I got to tell you.
I am sadistic. There's no doubt about it. I'm sadomasochistic, but. The solution to me is to empower individuals to go forward, and then we the people demand something. Okay, so take for example, you hear Walt Thornhill and Donald Scott say there's no such thing as magnetic reconnection. Well, here's an experiment. Take and put you this comes out of the Hawkins Field Journal. This is how I learned this. You take a small piece of metal, like cut the end off of a nail or something, and then you magnetize it by rubbing it in a magnet. Tie it to a string at the center point, at the balance point. You can then observe the field lines by hovering it over the magnet. And so you will see the nail as it goes around these field lines. However, if they were actually discrete lines, what you should see when you lift it back and forth is a discrete jump between the field lines. And that's not something that you find. You find a continuous and the same vector, maybe slightly changing because of the curvature of the field. But as you pull it out, it will always face along that field line. So what we must know about magnetism is there must be concentrations and dilutions, but not disconnections. Connections and disconnections are an electrical feature. And Alfvén himself came forward at his 1970 Nobel Prize, and he said he didn't rail, but he warned against only using his equations from the earlier part of his career in the 50s and 60s to go on with magnetism without electricity. So the individual themselves need to convince themselves that such ideas like frozen end fields and magnetic reconnection are already not correct. If you study at all about the speed of light, you can only but come to the conclusion that it cannot be a particle if you know anything about Newton's laws and thermodynamics. So the individual has to demand a better situation. And then they can challenge people they meet on the internet, who can challenge their professors, who can challenge their departments, and eventually they'll demand from the journals that they allow something in, such as the Amazonian dark earths and the proof that the Amazon rainforest is a man-made paradise. It was not a pure environment, and no, of course it couldn't have been because of the ice ages.
I think you just said it though, Shifu. The future sort of is going to be determined by the general society's demand to be critical and have critical thinking, and I'm not sure we're not all doomed.
It only takes a few. What did Gareth say though? Gareth said that 0.01.
Right.
The atoms have to ionize to create the plasma flow. So it doesn't take too many. You're doing it right now, and the electric doing it, and Gareth that see the pattern. It does take. We have to do the work, and some of it's going to be free. You know, when I created the Electric Universe Gateway, there was no money involved, and I wasn't looking to get any money. And so you know, I wanted to create a tool that didn't exist because Gareth, he said it. His father said, "Where's the proof?" And he said, you know, like that, right? Because there wasn't a single resource for him to just pull up a search. But if you go to the Electric Universe Gateway right now and you search dark matter, you're going to get hundreds of articles. If you search for climate change, you're going to find a link to an article that they have hundreds of dissenting opinions from scientists on climate change. So we need to leverage technology. It doesn't need to be a religion. The technocracy as a political religious movement is the wrong direction to go, because we'll end up worshiping smartphones.
We kind of already do.
Well, we kind of do. And these kids, they don't know any better. When they come in, I say, hey, you're going to get TechSneck.
Yeah, that's
you
for
have
real.
You educate everybody individually educating, and then you give them the resources. Whether they read it or not, that's the other end of the spectrum.
Yep, setting the brush fires, liberty in the hearts and minds of men, I think is what who was it? Thomas Jefferson said that. You know, you don't need a majority, you need a tireless, irate minority willing to set the brush fires of liberty in the hearts and minds of men. It's kind of the same thing with this. You just got, because people can't unhear what they've heard. So that's kind of where I'm coming down on this whole thing. And I'm going to put it out there, and I'm hoping that people find value in it and will continue to come back for that. And that's what I want to do, is just provide that value, right?
Well, that's why you know what Gareth is doing is beautiful, because he combines that art and that visual, because it is necessary and people need to be drawn in. But that's why I dropped those experiments, because those are things that that people can do. You know, go get yourself a plasma ball. This stuff doesn't cost hardly anything. You know,
well, you can buy a plasma ball at a novelty shop at Spencer's Gifts or something,
or on
like
Amazon,
that.
and you'll have it within 2 days. I mean, how wonderful is that?
And they're cheap. Like some dude gave me this one. He just had it in his truck. Was like, here. So now it's in my studio. Awesome stuff. So Gareth, let's talk about as we wrap up here. tell us where people can find you, how they can contact you if they want to talk to you and have other people want to have you on their shows and things like that. How's that all come down?
So obviously the channel is See the Pattern, so it's on YouTube. I also have an email address, so if people want to contact me, which is 533 the pattern, so that's C in letters 533 the pattern at gmail.com. And it's a fairly young channel. I've been going since January, but hopefully people are finding the stuff that I'm putting out useful, and I'm hoping to grow it. And for me, it's a great way to force me to look into these things, to drive me to want to learn and understand more. And that's what keeps me going. It's just the curiosity to want to understand how it works.
And it looks good stuff. It's good stuff, folks. Go check that out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe while you're over there too, because like he says, he's been doing this since January, and there's like 40 plus. You got 40 plus videos up here.
Yeah.
So you're really pumping out the content on here.
Time flies. Amazing.
Well, it just speaks to the subject matter too. There's volumes of information that sort of needs to kind of be correlated and brought together and biteable pieces, so that it makes it easier to kind of understand. Now, Shifu, how do people get a hold of you? And you've been on the show how many times now? So
not enough and too many. I don't know. It's
I think people talk about you all the damn time.
they can obviously join the Facebook group, The Pulse, and where we do we post research and everything. They can come to the Electric Universe Gateway, which very soon there will be a WordPress version that will even make it easier. There will be an easier domain. I know you'll probably link that out there. You can also read my papers at uky.academia.edu/Shifu Careaga. That's SHIFUCAREAGA. And the newest paper is actually not an electric cosmology, and I do want people to go and download it. It's a security, 21st cybersecurity for the average person. It's a 40-page checklist, so print it out, utilize it. There's even a series of downloads. If you want, you can download the security programs that I use at the very bottom. I'm always putting out new content for people, and it's all currently for free. Some people said I should sell this, and I was like, no, it's, I want everybody's grandma and aunt and brothers and sisters and everything to be secure, because in the time to come, it's absolutely vital the way the internet is going. So please do check that out. But also on ResearchGate, if anybody gets really deep and they want to read some math, then they can get my stuff off of ResearchGate.
Awesome stuff. Well, there you go, folks. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedules to do this with me. As always, I learn a ton. Look forward to doing this again, hopefully in the near future, especially as new stuff comes out. We'll be circling back and wanting to discuss this more. Thanks for listening, everyone. Check us out at www.noshitcast.com. It's KNOWSHITCAST.com. Make sure you hit those like and subscribe buttons. Leave us a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you rate us on iTunes. 5 stars, please. If you like what we do, please share us. It would be greatly appreciated, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye, Sickles. And that's how we do it.